All right, good morning, everyone. It is officially 9:10, so we're going to go ahead and start with the adopted principles-based definition. And I'm assuming that our room is not full because a lot of people have already heard about the principles-based bond definition. At least I hope that most people have. To kick it off, my name is Julie Gann. I am the Assistant Director of Solvency Policy at the NAIC. I provide staff support to the Statutory Accounting Principles Working Group, and I'm joined by Kevin Clark.
I'm Kevin Clark. I am the Chief Accounting and Reinsurance Specialist at the Iowa Insurance Division. I also Vice Chair SAPWIG and have been very, very involved in the development of the principles-based bond definition.
So there is a training that's available for everyone. We've been talking about for quite some time. I will just steal the thunder and say it's effective in about 4 months. So we're hoping that everyone's fairly familiar with it. We're hoping companies are taking steps. A lot of the slides that you're going to see here today have been presented before, so hopefully it's not too much of a repeat. We are going to go into a little bit more detail on things for regulators to look for, because we know this conference is attended, more heavily by regulators, but we definitely welcome all questions and comments as we work through the slides. So with that, kicking off with some learning objectives, just to talk about the adopted changes, discuss classification between issuer credit obligations, asset-backed securities, and that we refer to as non-bond debt securities, and then some practical applications for implementation. My disclaimer is on the slide. Always, materials in the presentation should not be considered authoritative. We paraphrase a lot. We always point to the adopted statutory accounting guidance as the authoritative source, as well as the state regulator. So if you're a regulator in the room, we point to you on the official determination on application of the bond project. I will also highlight that everything that's been adopted for the bond definition is publicly posted. It's all available on the SAP Working Group website under the Documents tab. Everything from the SAPs, the reporting revisions, the issue paper, as well as the link to take the free NAIC training that goes into a lot more detail than what we will capture today. All right, so as I mentioned, hopefully everyone is familiar with the principles-based bond definition. Just by a show of hands, everyone's heard it? Everyone's ready? Okay, that makes me very happy. Just to give a little bit of a background overview, for those who aren't familiar, it really started in response to the increased innovation that we saw with regards to debt securities and what was being reported as bonds on Schedule D1, and recognizing that a lot of regulators didn't recognize or understand the complexity of some of these investments that were calling bonds on Schedule D1 that were not what we would consider traditional bonds. What we've done is we've created the principles-based bond definition to help identify what should be reported on Schedule D as a bond and what should not qualify as reporting within that construct. One of the questions I get is whether this is something that's going to have to be revised over time, and that is not the goal. The goal is that these principles will kind of stand true to encompass additional changes. We fully expect that the debt security design and market will continue to innovate, and so we're hoping that these principles could be a stable platform to assess those securities on determining whether they qualify for bond reporting. Another key thing to highlight is that compliance is always on the insurance company. They're the ones who are responsible for assessing their investment portfolio and making those determinations, but they should have documentation that support those classifications that's available for auditors or for regulator use upon demand. And then my last little plug there on the very bottom of the slide, designations in any form, whether they come directly from the SVO or a CRP, do not determine investment classification. That's a long-standing truth, I guess. Designations have never determined, how an investment should be reported, but there was a lot of misunderstanding that sometimes if a designation existed, it was a bond. And so it was true before, but it's even more true now with regards to the principles-based bond definition. Just because there's a designation doesn't mean it should be reported as a bond. Any comments?
No, not yet.
All right. Let's move on into what's actually been adopted. I will highlight that it's been a very deliberative process from the beginning involving regulators and industry. We had a lot of support and assistance with industry with regards to developing the principles and getting this all the way through the final stages. A big theme is substance over form with regards to reporting as a bond. What you see on the slide are the revisions that have been adopted. First and foremost is SAP 26. That is our bond standard. The actual bond definition is included within SAP 26. So if you're looking to see whether something qualifies, that's where your location that you would go. The rest of the guidance in SAP 26 on accounting and reporting really remains virtually unchanged as a result of this change. So if it's an issuer credit obligation, which we'll get into in a little bit more, it would stay within SAP 26 for accounting and reporting. We've also adopted revisions to SAP 43R, currently known as our loan-backed and structured security SAP, but renamed to be asset-backed securities as part of the bond definition. So if the structure qualifies or needs to be assessed as an ABS, it would go to SAP 43R for that guidance. And then the non-bond debt securities, those items that do not qualify for bonds will move to SAP 21. We have new guidance that provides the accounting and reporting for those SAPs within that guidance. And then we have another document that's referred to as the revisions to other SAPs. This is mostly references. Name changes due to SAP 43R, but a key item to note here is that with these changes, asset-backed securities are no longer permitted to be reported as cash equivalents or short-term investments, regardless of the length of time until they mature. Only issuer credit obligations will be allowed to be reported on DA or E2. And then with that change, we also had a subsequent change where we eliminated the ability for anything that goes on Schedule BA, as well as mortgage loans, to be prevented from being reported on Schedule DA or E2 as cash equivalents or short-term investments. All of those should go on their long-term schedule going forward. I mentioned everything's effective January 1, 2025, and like I said, 4 months to go.
So Julie, since these changes aren't, in the AP&P manual that's currently effective, where can people go to actually read the standard before it becomes officially part of the AP&P manual? The
SAP Working Group webpage. Everything is posted there. And we actually just adopted a slight change, and we have that updated version is currently available. It's all out there. Anyone can go and access it. All right, moving on to reporting revisions. We have a lot of reporting revisions. Things are going to look dramatically different come the first quarter filing in 2025, and then particularly for year-end 2025 once these are in effect. All bonds will still be considered bonds and reported on that line on the balance sheet, but we've divided Schedule D into 2 reporting schedules. So we have D11, which is issuer credit obligations, and I already mentioned that those are in scope of SAP 26. And then we have D12, which are asset-backed securities in scope of 43. With the change, we have completely revamped the bond reporting lines. They look nothing than like what exists today. They're much more detailed, many more options, and the whole point of that is to have greater transparency and granularity of the type of investments that are actually held. So for example, in SAP 43, we divide the asset-backed securities on whether they're financial asset-backed, whether they are financial asset-backed that's self-liquidating, financial asset-backed that are equity-backed, non-financial asset-backed that have a meaningful cash flow that meet the practical expedient, and then non-financial asset-backed that do not meet that practical expedient. And one of the reasons that we've done that is so that regulators have the ability to pinpoint their review based on the type of the underlying investment that it is. So if you want to spend more focus on those that are equity-backed securities, then you should hopefully have that easily identifiable for you in the D12 reporting. We've also revised the columns. There's more information that's going to be collected with regards to these securities. And then for Schedule BA, we have new reporting lines for those non-bond debt securities, which again are those debt securities that do not qualify as bonds. That first reporting revision change is over 200 pages long. So although we focus mostly on Schedule D, as everyone's aware, Schedule D and those reporting lines go throughout the entire reporting blank. So there were blanks throughout the entire investment schedules to refer to those new reporting lines. I'll also give everyone a heads up that the RBC formula is looking to be revised this fall. We'll hopefully have a new exposure. Not looking to have any significant factor changes as a result of this, at least not yet, that's outside my purview. But if anything, to refer to the new reporting lines, the new structure, so all of the references and direct pulls that may occur now from the annual statement to the RBC formula will be updated as well.
So it's probably clear from what Julie just walked through, but because the reporting is going to use a lot of these new terms that are part of the bond definition, getting kind of the value of this new reporting structure is going to be dependent on understanding some of that terminology. So we're going to go through a lot of that today, but that would be, I guess, kind of where I would encourage you to spend your time, because I think the value of understanding what the characteristics of the investments are will come from having a good understanding of what those terms mean.
All right, so what is a bond? The definition is the first line on this screen. So a bond represents a security structure representing a creditor relationship with a fixed payment schedule. For those of you that are familiar with SAP 26, you probably think this isn't much different than what exists now, and that would be true. But the devil's in the details, so if you go to SAP 26, there's a lot of information on what it means to have a creditor relationship. And so that's a key thing to highlight. Like I said before, substance over form, just so if someone designs something to reflect a debt security, it doesn't necessarily qualify as a bond. And currently, the application of SAP 26, if it qualifies under that legal format, it's generally reported as a bond, even though the performance could be based on an equity security that fluctuates over time. That's not going to be permitted under the current bond standard. Couple things to highlight. As I mentioned, design matters, not name. So, naming convention will not determine whether something qualifies as a bond. And then again, anything that has an underlying equity interest or is in substance, an ownership interest will not qualify as a bond. So if the principal or interest varies by a non-bond debt variable, then it fails the bond definition. So going into a little bit further detail, so we have two broad classes for the bonds, for classification of bonds. The first is the issuer credit obligation. Those are the SAP 26 structures. Those I refer to as the traditional bond type dynamics. Ultimately, payment of that structure is based on the general creditworthiness of an operating entity or entities. There could always be secondary collateral, but for these dynamics, you have to expect that the bond will be paid without reliance on that collateral. If you rely on that collateral to generate cash flows, it does not qualify as an issuer credit obligation. The next category is an asset-backed security. And again, these are dynamics in which the primary purpose is for an ABS issuer to raise capital backed by collateral that provides the cash flows. So you have collateral, either financial asset-backed or non-financial asset-backed collateral, such as a lease-backed security, that generates cash flows, that is collected, and that is used to pay the debt security. Excuse me. There we go. All right, so this is the basic bond principles flow chart. So on the left side, you have the issuer obligation. So if it qualifies as an issuer obligation, then it's a bond. So you can imagine, there's a desire to get things classified as an issuer credit obligation. So again, have to look at those to make sure it's not relying on the underlying collateral to produce cash flows. But once it meets that criteria, then it's a bond, it's done, analysis can end. On the right side is the path for the asset-backed securities. And you'll see we have two tracks for that. One if it's financial asset-backed, the other one if it's non-financial asset-backed. For both of them, the concept of substantive credit enhancement must be present. And then for non-financial asset-backed securities, it also has to have meaningful cash flows. And we'll go into those concepts in a little bit more detail.
Maybe just to pause here, who's seen this flow chart before and has some familiarity with it? Okay. I always like to plug, if there's one thing to take away from any of these sessions, it's that this is kind of the defining flow chart. So to the extent that you are heavily involved in investment analysis and that type of thing, I would suggest just printing this off and having it there at your desk, because this is really, you know, a one-page encapsulation of the entire bond definition.
All right, so going into a little bit more detail on the asset-backed security designs. First and foremost, in order to qualify as a bond for all asset-backed securities, you have to be in a different economic position than if you held the underlying collateral directly. This is the concept of substantive credit enhancement. It's a key focus with regards to the revisions of the bond definition. If you or if the insurer is not in a different economic position, then it doesn't qualify as a bond. Now, this could occur through a variety of designs. So if there's a guarantee, over-collateralization, recourse, subordination, then it could qualify as a bond. It does require to have the substantive credit enhancement. So you can't just have an underlying tranche with, you know, $1 in it and say that's substantive. No, that doesn't qualify. It has to put you in a different economic position by holding it as this debt structure than if you had just held the collateral directly. And again, an NAIC designation does not provide standalone evidence that that exists. So from the very beginning, we've given an example of mortgage loans. So if you have a mortgage loan and you move it to an SPV, and then the SPV issues a debt security back that reflects the pass-through of the mortgage loan, that's not a bond. That's mortgage loans. You have mortgage loan risk. Now, you could recharacterize that risk if there are some tranches or if there's an agency guarantee, then it would qualify as a debt security, again, assuming it's substantive. But just the repositioning of mortgage loans into an SPV in which you hold that pass-through certificate does not qualify within the bond definition. And again, this is a requirement for all asset-backed security structures. If it doesn't qualify, then it fails, and it's in the non-bond debt security classification.
Do you want to go?
This is still
me.
All right, sorry. All right, so, and I kind of just went through some of this initially, so the substantive credit enhancement, and I know this is probably pretty small for you out there. The first one is the agency-backed pass-through structure, some examples. This should qualify as a bond or be verified to qualify as a bond with very little analysis required. If there's an agency guarantee that you know that that risk has been redistributed, they're taking on that guarantee, you're definitely in a different economic position than if you held it directly. The bottom example is those non-agency backed pass-through structures, which I just discussed with regards to those mortgage loans. And again, just because there's not an agency guarantee doesn't mean it won't qualify. It just has to be structured appropriately. So again, if there's tranches, if there's a water flow structure, if you hold a higher tranche and there's a subordination tranche, then it could still qualify for reporting as a bond.
And I think it's helpful here to kind of understand what the purpose of this substantive credit enhancement concept is. And, you know, it really came about from some of the observations that we had before, you know, we began developing the bond definition, which was that securitization SPV type vehicles were being used to basically kind of recharacterize underlying collateral as bonds without really any kind of transformation of the risk of that collateral. So it was really just a pass through, and there wasn't any real substance to the SPV. It was just trying to get this debt legal form to get more favorable capital treatment. And so that's what this concept is really getting at. The structure has to be doing something that is economically substantive in order for you to be able to call what comes out of it a bond. All right. So we do have some polling questions. I think the people online may or may not be getting them at the same time as we're going over them, but they're really more discussion pieces for us in the room, since we obviously don't need them for CPE. But to maybe just go through this one to illustrate the substantive credit enhancement concept. So the question is, an NAIC designation provides standalone evidence of substantive credit enhancement. A, yes, always. If it has an NAIC designation from any CRP, it's a bond. B, yes, but only if it's an SVO designation. C, yes, but only if the investment is a NAIC 1 or 2. And then D, no, an NAIC designation does not provide standalone evidence of substantive credit enhancement. Any volunteers? D, yeah. I'm glad you got that one, because I believe Julie just spent about 10 minutes repeating that over and over. All right, so yep, so it's D. Now, so we've stressed that that a CRP rating or an NAIC designation is not determinative, but we have gotten a lot of questions about, okay, so does it provide us any information? Can we use that in developing our accounting policies for what constitutes substantive? And the answer to that is yes. It is a data point, and it's a relevant data point. It's just you can't blindly rely on that. And so we have this application question that talks about a situation where if a security is rated investment grade by an NRSRO at origination, can an entity make the assumption that it has substantive credit enhancement? Can they use credit quality to categorize the bonds or tag them for further analysis? Essentially, can they use that in their accounting policies? And so the answer to that is yes. One, you have to determine what is the form of my substantive credit enhancement. That can come in a lot of different ways. Julie talked about an overarching guarantee. It can come in the form of over-collateralization, either within or external to the structure, as long as you have recourse to it. Or it can come most commonly through subordination. So somebody that's taking the bottom part of this structure and takes the first losses to provide credit enhancement to the tranches that are above it. And so once you've identified that form of credit enhancement, you can then do some diligence to understand, okay, what do the rating agencies do when they're rating some of the debt tranches? And based off of that, you might conclude that they're doing essentially what we would do in order to determine what's substantive. Based on our understanding of that, we are going to utilize this in our accounting policy to say, for this particular asset class, we've gained an understanding of what the CRPs are doing. This is what is providing the substantive credit enhancement. And so we're going to develop an accounting policy that utilizes those CRP ratings to stratify and categorize my population. And we'll go through an example here next to better illustrate that, I think. So for example, let's just talk about CLOs. CLOs tend to be a pretty homogeneous population. They're all structured very, very similarly. So what is a CLO, first of all, in case this is new to anyone? But basically, all a CLO does is take a bunch of corporate loans, put them into this special purpose vehicle, and then the special purpose vehicle issues debt tranches out of that securitization that are backed by the cash flows on those loans. And so each tranche will have a different priority, and the cash flows from the underlying loans are defined in how they apply to each one. And that will go from a AAA rated tranche all the way down to the residual tranche, which is typically not rated. Okay, so first of all, which branch of the flow chart are we talking about with CLOs? Well, the loans represent financial assets. Why do they represent financial assets? Because a loan represents an amount owed. There's no further performance obligation. That amount is due according to the payment terms of the loan, and it therefore kind of self-liquidates over time without any further element of performance. So that clearly falls within the financial asset definition, which means one, we just have to show that there's a creditor relationship in substance, and two, that there's substantive credit enhancement. Generally, the creditor relationship in substance is pretty easy unless there's something really strange like some kind of equity variable. For instance, if it paid a coupon based on the underlying loans, but then had an S&P index kicker on top of it, that would be the kind of thing that would cause it to fail a creditor relationship, because that's starting to introduce equity risk into the structure rather than what we commonly think of as debt risk. Okay, so the creditor relationship should be a pretty easy one to clear here. So what we really have to do is look at substantive credit enhancement. So this company, through discussion of with their front office and assessment of their portfolio, determined I've got a homogeneous portfolio of CLOs that all have the same type of characteristics. And so we've reviewed the CRP ratings, methodologies of all the CRPs, and we understand that if they're providing a rating for any of the debt tranches, which will be based off of the subordination of the residual tranche, that we would have a similar conclusion that that represents a substantive amount of credit enhancement. And so I could then develop a policy that says, so long as my debt tranche that I'm holding has a CRP rating, we view that as substantive. And so it's kind of distinguishing between, what Julie was kind of saying, which is that it's not just because it has a CRP rating doesn't necessarily mean it's a bond, to that also doesn't mean that we can't use that as a data point in developing our accounting policies. All right, so now to move on to the next concept of the bond definition, which only applies to non-financial asset-backed securities. So I just talked a little bit about what constitutes a financial asset, so let's talk about what constitutes a non-financial asset. So non-financial assets are pretty much anything that doesn't meet the financial asset criteria. So think about things like hard assets, real estate, autos, airplanes, that type of thing, where there's really no way to derive the value from it unless I lease it or sell it, right? And so, there's a lot of types of securitizations, really an endless number of types of securitizations that can fit this criteria. And in order to meet the bond definition, they have to produce meaningful cash flows. So why is that? Why do we have this meaningful cash flow concept? Well, when we think about bonds, what do we think about? We think about fixed income cash flows, right? We, particularly for life insurers, they have long dated liabilities, and they typically match that with similar duration fixed income bonds to match the cash flows on their liabilities. And so without having this kind of concept, there could be, things like, we talked about equity, but there's also other types of non-financial assets that could be securing that debt that introduces a risk that really isn't fixed income. And so when you're talking about non-financial assets, there has to be a way for that non-financial asset to produce fixed income cash flows in order for it to have the characteristics that we feel a bond should have. And so to kind of illustrate some examples, so as I mentioned, airplanes are non-financial assets. So if I just have a securitization of dormant airplanes that are just kind of sitting there, and my way to repay that debt is ultimately going to be to either refinance the debt or to sell the airplanes and repay it, that does not constitute meaningful cash flows. There's no fixed income stream associated with that. So the risk that I really have is the valuation of the aircraft, which is not something that we consider to be bond risk. On the other hand, if I've got a portfolio of airplanes and they all have leases such that they're being leased out to airlines, and that lease is then producing fixed income cash flows into the structure that are then used to repay the debt, that is a form of meaningful cash flow. And so that kind of illustrates the concept, and then we can go even deeper if we go to the next slide. Okay. So one of the things that we wanted to put in place to make this meaningful cash flow concept a bit more manageable is we introduced something that we refer to as a practical expedient to limit the number of investments that require this full analysis. And so essentially what it is if there's a form of cash flows that provides enough fixed income cash flow to pay all of the interest and at least 50% of the principal on the debt, that meets this practical expedient and can automatically be determined to have meaningful cash flows. If it doesn't meet that practical expedient, it doesn't mean that it automatically doesn't qualify as a bond. It just requires a more fulsome analysis of the type of collateral, the variability in the cash flow, the variability in the value of the collateral, to determine whether, in the context of the types of assets that are being securitized, whether this constitutes a meaningful level of fixed income cash flows. So I think that generally covers it. Julie, is there anything else on that point that you would?
I would just highlight the very last component on the slide, because we get this question a lot. So it has to be contractual cash flows to service the debt. So if you have a dynamic where you have a debt issuance that's going to mature in 10 years and it's backed by a 3-year lease, by default, it will not qualify under the practical expedient. Now, that's not to say it won't qualify under the assessment of the meaningful cash flows. Like Kevin mentioned, you have to assess the ability to release that and look at the underlying collateral, do a more detailed full analysis. But by default, those dynamics will not qualify under the practical expedient because the contractual cash flows is only related to that 3-year lease, and you have a 10-year debt instrument that you are on the hook for.
Yeah, and then we'll use kind of this example to more fully illustrate the concept. So our favorite example that we've used in the past, because I really think it kind of illustrates this dynamic, is with the securitization of art, which actually do exist. We have seen examples of this. So the question is, an SPV is formed to issue debt and purchase multiple pieces of art in a true sale. The art is leased to reputable museums, and cash flows received from the lease payments are applied to the SPV's debt service and are sufficient to cover all the interest and amortize at least 50% of the principal. The proportion of the initial loan to the art's value is 50%, and the security has a AA rating from a CRP. So this is going to be subject to the non-financial asset requirements, which means it has to have both the substantive credit enhancement and meaningful cash flow. So the company, looks at the LTV of the debt in compared to the value of the art, which is at, 50%? And based on their understanding of the stability of the value, they determine that constitutes a substantive amount of credit enhancement. That's 50% of value that the art would have to lose before they would incur any kind of loss. So then looking at the meaningful cash flow concept, because there is a lease in place that provides contractual fixed income cash flows to pay all of the interest and at least 50% of the debt, it qualifies under the practical expedient, and no further analysis is necessary. Now, if we move to the next slide, all the facts are essentially the same, except that there are no leases in place. So there's really no means for the art to produce meaningful cash flows. The interest on the bonds, PIKs, which is a term that's getting used more and more, so I'm going to just take 1 second to explain what that means, because it is a very common feature, particularly in securitizations. The term PIK, which stands for payment in kind, is actually more of a deferral of interest feature in most of these. And so it refers to a period of time where instead of the interest that's accruing getting paid in cash, it essentially just adds to the principal balance. And so there's actually no cash flow coming off even to service the interest. And so that's what would have to be happening in a situation where art is securitized without any way to produce cash flows, in which case the entire risk related to that investment is that you're unable to sell the art at the end to get the cash flow to repay the debt. We do not find the art valuation to be a risk characteristic that we would expect of a bond in an insurer's investment portfolio. Therefore, it has no meaningful cash flows and doesn't qualify under the bond definition.
And I will just highlight that that's an actual example that was filed years ago with the NEIC SVO for a designation. Just, we didn't make it up.
Are you covering this?
Yep, I sure can. So then that just brings, yes, sir, in the back.
You brought up picks. Is there going to be a hard rule that if you need to pick so many years that it's not, that you can argue it's not producing either cash flow?
There's not a rule, and I don't necessarily expect to have one. I do think there's been a lot of discussion. One, there's been some discussion on the VOSTF side of how PIC features should impact like credit ratings and designations and that type of thing. So I think those conversations are probably ongoing. But I also think there's been some discussion of perhaps having more disclosure around, and I believe that's part of the reporting changes that we are putting in place to disclose when interest actually has been deferred or picked, so that we as regulators have that information. In most cases, so I mentioned that many securitizations have this feature. It's not typically used. And it is an indicator, if it is being used to a wide degree, that the structure is experiencing stress because they're essentially smoothing the cash flow in hopes that the underlying collateral starts to reperform and then can catch back up on its interest payments. So it's really important for regulators to have that information in order to be able to assess, hey, is there an impairment needed here? Are companies doing timely impairments? And of course, then also, if that's happening to such a material degree in a portfolio, you'd start to really, question whether whether this should be impacting companies' measurement of solvency.
And just to build on that, for those unaware, we did adopt new disclosures with regards to PICs. The initial one was adopted to SAP 34, which is a SAP that encompasses all structures. So it is not just limited to items that are reported as bonds, but it's an aggregate disclosure, and that was effective either last year or the year before. So that should already be available for regulator use to assess the prevalence of PICs within the financial statement investments. And then, as Kevin mentioned, one of the column changes for the bond revisions is to get specific information on an investment by investment basis of the amount of PIC interest that's included within the principal balance. So again, you would be able to have that information for assessment purposes. Moving on to another polling question. Hopefully Ray gets this one as well. Can asset-backed securities be reported as cash equivalent or short-term investments? I think I heard it. It's a no. It's a no regardless of when they are acquired. Under the current guidance right now, so as of today, changing January 1, 2025, you can report investments as cash equivalents or short-term investments if you acquire it within 90 days or 365 days of the maturity. Unlike US GAAP, we do not reclassify items from long-term to short-term, so you have to acquire it within that short-term classification for that current reporting. But again, with the bond revisions, as well as additional revisions to Schedule BA and mortgage loans, those will no longer be permitted on Schedule DA. And again, the whole reason for that is because there has to be assessments to those securities. We didn't want to have a dynamic where someone acquired an asset-backed security with a shortened maturity date just to get it on DA without doing those substantive credit enhancement or meaningful cash flow assessments. So that's why they no longer qualify for reporting on those schedules. All right, so that takes us to the debt securities that do not qualify as bonds. These are the most recently adopted revisions to SAP 21, and again, they address those debt securities that don't qualify for Schedule D reporting. These are things that could have qualified in the past, or these are things that may originate in the future. Regardless, if they don't qualify under the bond definition, then they will follow the guidance in SAP 21. They do have to be security structures. So with that component, there's only 3 reasons why a debt security would not qualify. First and foremost, it lacks a creditor relationship. That could apply regardless of the structure of the debt security. So if it looks like an issuer credit obligation or if it looks like an asset-backed security, either one of those dynamics could fail based on the creditor relationship. And then if it's a debt security that passes that creditor relationship test, but it lacks that substantive credit enhancement, which again would focus on the asset-backed security structures, then it would fail. And then as Kevin just discussed, those items that would fail as a result of the meaningful cash flow guidance. One of the things for Schedule BA in SAP 21 is if it fails the bond definition and if it's a structure in which the underlying collateral generates the cash flows to service the debt. If that underlying collateral does not qualify as an admitted asset, then it would be non-admitted as a result of the new guidance. And the reason for that is because we wanted to parallel the collateral loan guidance. We didn't want to have dynamics in which a collateral loan structure, which is generally not a security, became a security so that it wouldn't have to pass the collateral loan provisions to be an admitted asset. So that's why those two things are in parallel. So if you have a pass-through of mortgage loans that fail the substantive credit enhancement test because it's just a pass-through without a substantive credit enhancement, that would be an admitted asset. Mortgage loans are admitted assets, no change there. But going back to our favorite artwork example, if it fails because it doesn't have meaningful cash flow, then that debt security would be a non-admitted asset, just like artwork is a non-admitted asset in statutory accounting. So for reporting on Schedule BA, we have new reporting lines. Those are shown on the screen. We have them bucketed by why they fail the bond definition. And we have instructions that companies should be reporting these based on what fails first. So creditor relationship fails, it goes there. If it passes all the tests but meaningful cash flows, then it would go in that final bucket. We do separate these items in accordance with the existing concepts that exist on Schedule BA for whether or not it has an NEIC SVO assigned designation. So for life companies, if they have filed the security with the SVO and only the SVO, and they've received a designation, they can report it on that reporting line. It maps through to AVR to get the same RBC treatment as if it was a bond security. We're really trying to highlight that just because it moves to Schedule BA doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad asset. It's just intending to clarify that it's not a bond dynamic. So for life companies, they can do that as SVO assigned designation. If it doesn't have one from the SVO, then it would go in the other bucket. And I will also highlight that there is no requirement for designations on Schedule BA. So companies do not have to get designations for these securities for RBC purposes. For the ones that do not qualify from the SVO or PC and health, all of these flow through the other line in Schedule BA. So they do get a higher RBC charge. Any comments on that one? All right, so our next polling question, and this is a question I've received a lot recently, has to do with when should a debt security be assessed for bond? And I really haven't captured it here today, but there's 4 options. 1, conditions that exist when the insurer acquires the security, limited to features that existed when the security was issued. 3rd is terms and expectations of a security when it was originated. And lastly, assessment is required every year based on security performance. And any thoughts from the room on what the answer should be? I'm hearing C, maybe? So the answer is C, after transition. I want to be careful, I clarified that. Assessment is always required based on the terms and expectations of the security when it was originated. Anything after that is reflecting the performance of the security, and really this is a substance and structure design. So that's why it's based on origination. It is not a performance component. So we will have things that qualify for bonds that are NAIC 1s all the way through NAIC 6s. Just because it falls down in performance or a lower credit quality doesn't mean it won't qualify for the bond treatment. And then it's important to highlight what the terms and expectations are at origination, because at the actual point of issuance, like the example on the screen is the principal protected note, on day one, that reflects a U.S. Treasury in cash. But we know that they're going to take that cash and invest it in alternative investments to generate an equity yield. So you have to look at what the actual expectation is for that debt security. Principal protected notes fail the bond definition because of that underlying performance of those equity items that are usually purchased on day two of that security structure.
It might also be worth noting to kind of illustrate why this needed to be at origination rather than at acquisition is if you had it at acquisition, that would mean that different companies would reach different conclusions about whether something qualifies as a bond depending on the date they purchased it, which doesn't make a lot of sense. The date you purchase it shouldn't determine whether it's a bond. It really is more of the concepts around what qualifies as a bond more, I guess, theoretically. And so it's really how the security is designed at origination that kind of matters for that purpose.
So moving into transition, as I've already mentioned, it's 4 months away. We know there's a lot of companies who've been working on this for the past year. We know that they've done a full assessment of their portfolio. Unfortunately, I'm not comfortable saying that all companies are in that same bucket, so there may be a little bit of scrambling here as we get close to the finish line. First and foremost, all debt securities must qualify as a bond on January 1st, 2025 to be reported as a bond going forward. There is no grandfathering. So when that assessment is complete, items that no longer qualify will move to Schedule BA. At the time of transition, companies can make their best estimates on whether it qualified as a bond. Here's our exception to that terms and expectations of origination. Some companies may not have that information to do that, so they can use what they have available. Hopefully it is from origination. If not, when they acquired it, and if they have to, current information to use their best efforts to determine whether an item qualifies as a bond. And then once an item is deemed to meet the bond definition, future assessments are not required unless they are questioned by an auditor or a regulator. As I mentioned before, changes in performance does not change the reporting schedule. We definitely don't want to see movement from Schedule D to Schedule BA, going back and forth. That is not the intent. Hopefully that's a one-time change for things that will not qualify, and then going forward that will be set. I will also highlight that we're not expecting a lot of movement from Schedule D to Schedule BA. There are insurance companies out there who have really stayed in what I would refer to as the more traditional structures with the issuer credit obligations or the agency-backed RMBS and CMBS. Those are going to qualify as bonds, with very little analysis. Now, there are other companies who've perhaps been a little bit more aggressive with investment portfolios, and those are the ones where they may have some movement to Schedule BA. Yes? So the NAIC has lots of tools available. I'm not going to make any promises at this point in time, but I will tell you that I have already received a report, even before our bond definition, of CUSIPs that are reported differently across the investment schedules. So we have the capability to do individual review of particular CUSIPs. And so that might be something that comes, in the future. We have jumpstart reports for designations for that comparability. So we have some tools that we can hopefully identify some of those dynamics. It's never going to be exactly the same, as much as we try to get, companies all reporting exactly the same. But we're hoping, over time it'll get there. Absolutely. Like if a company should have classified it on BA and they did not, they could move it. Or if somebody moved it to BA because they're trying to be very conservative and they want to put it back, again, there's no restrictions against that.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, this is, the nature of a principles-based definition is that, like, there's a fair bit of judgment and subjectivity that will go into applying it. So I would fully expect different companies might come to different conclusions on particular investments. So I guess I would expect there to be instances where two companies might classify an investment differently. I think we should have a way to, run a report to identify that and, dig into it, particularly to the extent that I've got a company that doesn't report anything on scheduled BA and I've got all these QSIPs that everybody else is not reporting as bonds. That would be an indicator that they're probably not doing their analysis on this and might just be putting everything on Schedule D without analysis. So I would probably dig in on that situation. But the fact that they're classified differently, between different companies in itself probably, in certain instances probably wouldn't raise major red flags to me on its own if it's just, fairly limited.
And this is our last slide. I know we're out of time. This is, again, just highlighting that everything's available. There are links there. I will give a plug for the NAIC self-study training. That is free to all. So for companies, we're really encouraging them to take it in 2024. In 2025, there will probably be a course fee. For regulators, it will always be free. But of course, obviously, I encourage you to take it as well. And then there's currently exposed for comment a QA implementation guide. It does not revise any of the concepts of the bond definition, but it just indicates how, to certain structures, how they should be applied, and that's currently exposed for comment, so it addresses some of the key questions that we get on particular structures at this time. And that's it, unless there's anything else to highlight. And we'll be up here for questions if anyone has anything specific afterwards.